Okay, so next let's set up the DI, so dependency injection with Hilt. Right at the top of our package here, I'm going to right click, create a new class. It's going to be Kotlin class. This is going to be Trivia application, right? And it's going to be at the root of our package there, Trivia application. And we're going to pass, and we're going to make it a Hilt. So we at Hilt Android app. Right? This is going to tie everything with, and make sure that also we are inheriting from application Android like this. Okay. Our application level class, which will govern this entire application and give Hilt the capability of binding all the dependencies throughout the entire application, the entire app project here. Okay, that means then we have to go to our manifest here and make it official by saying Android name and pass our Trivia application like this to say that indeed we're registering this Trivia application Hilt Android app here in our Android manifest file, which means now the entire app will have access and will allow the binding to happen. And while we're here, let's add the user's permission and say internet, because we will need the internet permission for us to be able to retrieve data from our JSON. Okay, so we're done here. Get rid of the application as well. Next, inside of our DI here, this is where we're going to create our app model, our app module. So this is going to be actually just an object. That's fine. And I'm going to call this app module such. And I'm going to say at module to say this is a Dagger or Hilt module, and I'm going to put that, and also I'm going to add here at install in to say this is going to, I'm going to pass the singleton component, right, class as such, and here is where we add all the providers that we need for the application, right? So we can pass, for instance, providing the repository, we can provide the DAO, we can provide the class that will instantiate a retrofit. And while I'm here also, inside of our utils here, I'm going to create a class or a file. And let's create this one called constants as such. So here is where I'm going to just add a few constants here. So what I'm going to do, I'm just make this an object as such. That way there's no instantiation. It's just a singleton, right? And here I'm going to say const val, it's a constant, and we're going to call this a base URL as such. So this is where we're going to add the URL to our JSON, this. Now, because in retrofit, things are a little bit different, right? You'll see is that even though this is the main URL, in fact, I'm going to put that inside of a comment so we have access to that. So we are actually going to get rid of this part, the last part, because we're going to pass that as a path. So we're going to stop at the last / like you see here to say this is indeed a base URL. Whatever comes after is just a path. I'm going to use that in a second. So now that we have our constant, that means then we can create an interface, which is going to be the API that we're going to be using to create a call that needs to happen to get this information here, this JSON. So inside of our network here, I'm going to create a new class, and this is going to be an interface. I'm going to call this, let's say question API. Let's say question API as such. So again, this question API is an interface. We want this to be a singleton. So I'm going to say at singleton. Right? All we want to pass here is at get. Notice this get is from retrofit, right? This is what we're going to be using. As you see, go back to our retrofit. You see, that's where we pass. So we're passing here. So we're saying here we're going to pass the path where we can get the information. In this case, go parse the JSON. So we use at get, the annotation, and then here we're going to pass the value. This is where we pass the world.json. Right? You're going to have to import that like this. So this is all from HTTP. This is all from retrofit HTTP. Now we're not done. So we're going to say suspend, because we know that this has to be outside of the main thread, had to happen in the background. So we're going to make this suspendable function. I'm going to call this get all questions. So what I'm doing here, I'm just getting all the questions from our trivia. And of course, this is going to be a question type that we're going to be wanting to receive. What that means, if I go to our model here, I'm just going to get an array list containing question items, which is going to be the actual data class that contains an instance of a question, answer, category, choices, and the question. It's an interface. In this case, that means we don't have to, we don't have to create the body of this get all question, right? This is going to be created at the class level. So having this, all this structure, get rid of some of this, we are now ready to go to our app model. We'll need to create, instantiate our retrofit. Now that's going to be done because we want this to be as close as possible to the clean architecture, to have all these compartmentalized classes that do one thing only. In our app model here, we are going to create a provider that will provide us the retrofit, right? Object, the builder that we need. Okay, so again, I'm going to say at, this is inside of our app module, right? So I'm going to say it's going to be a singleton because we don't want repetition, or we don't want many instances of this class to be floating around. And this is going to be a provider because it's going to provide something in our dependencies. So I'm going to say fun. I'm going to say provide. Notice the naming convention here. Question API, like this. And of course, it's going to inherit from question API that we created. Which means then the body here, I'm going to say it needs to return, I'm going to say retrofit, okay, dot builder, and then to build everything, new line, dot baseline, or base URL. We need to pass that base URL. We have that base URL, which is our from a constants, and I'm going to get the base URL, and then we are going to do something else because we need to pass in that converter to make it easy for us to convert what we're getting, for instance, from our JSON here into objects that we can then convert them into the objects that we created here, like a question item or question there. We need to pass along the converter here. So I'm going to say dot add converter factory as such, and I'm going to say JSON like this, converter factory as such dot create. All right, so I'm creating that, which means I'll have to import that. Now this is possible, we're getting that from retrofit because we added this dependency earlier. Okay, very good. And then I'm going to say build that is, and then I'm going to create that service. Aha, so I'm putting all in one place. So I'm going to create that service. I need to pass the class that is responsible to create that service. So I'm going to say question API. It's going to be just a class.java as such. So we're adding this in app module because remember, this will allow us to create this provider. We're going to provide this dependency to anybody who needs this dependency. So the whole project will have access to this dependency, which is great. And this is going to be a singleton, which means we're just going to have one instance created of our provider here, right? Our retrofit, which is exactly what we want. So there we go. Now, again, remember this base URL here. Notice the difference. We just have the base URL. I said earlier, we got rid of the path because we needed that path to show inside of our question API. That needs to be passed because then it will know, so okay, get what? Well, we're going to get this path here. So it's going to append this path to this base URL to get the whole payload. In this case here, retrofit is really straightforward because we just have one path, but in a complex API, JSON API, you can see that you can perform a lot of different requests, right? You can put other functions here in this API. For instance, if you want to get and pass an ID to get a certain item in the database through the API and so forth. So you can do things like this. It's much easier because then we can append other things or other paths, if you will, or IDs and so forth. Okay, but this is simple, so it works even better too. All right, so we are making good progress here. I know there aren't a lot of things visually that we can see and feel good about ourselves, but this is the setting up, and it's important to make sure that everything is set up, and then we move forward like that.